Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. I'm delighted to be joined for this episode in her second appearance on the Presidencies podcast, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Dr. Chervinsky is a historian of the presidency, political culture, and the government. She joined us in 2020 to discuss her first book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. Since she last joined us, Lindsay has co-edited Mourning the Presidents, Lost in Legacy in American Culture, which was published in 2023. She has had numerous op-eds printed in various publications and has appeared on a multitude of news programs and podcasts. She appears frequently on the Listening to America podcast and has even created her own Audible course, The Best and Worst Presidential Cabinets in U.S. History. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and is starting a new role as executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. If that all wasn't enough, her second book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, is hitting the book stands on September 5th, 2024. Lindsay was gracious enough to join us to discuss her new book. And once you're done with this episode, I encourage you, if you're listening to this prior to the publication date, to pre-order the book. Lindsay has a campaign with Porchlight where she's offering 30% off for a signed copy complete with an Adams-themed book plate she designed herself. I'll have a link to the pre-order on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and I'll share information on my social media around the release of this episode. Even if you're listening to this after the book is released, I still encourage you to pick up a copy, as it's an amazing read. Without further ado, after this quick message, we'll get to my conversation with Lindsay.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me back. I really appreciate it.
And congratulations on the upcoming release of your second book. We were able to talk about your first book, The Cabinet, and now I'm just so excited to be able to talk about not only your second book, but also somebody who is kind of a favorite around here on the Presidencies podcast, John Adams. He doesn't always get as much attention, and I try to give him as much attention as possible and I think your book highlights just how pivotal those 4 years that he was president really were for the office and for the nation.
Well, thank you. It's very exciting to have the second book almost out there, and I totally agree. I'm so glad that you came away after reading the book with that sense. I do think he's underappreciated generally, but especially his presidency, because so much of what he did was to exercise restraint or to seek diplomacy, and those are just less flashy than, winning wars and things like that. So I do think we overlook him, and I hope that he gets a little bit more of his due.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things, and I just want to kind of get us started out with, your work highlights that his relationship with his immediate predecessor, Washington, was a rather complicated one. And as you can imagine, as any of us can imagine, I think following up from George Washington was always going to be a tough challenge for anybody. So, Lindsay, I was wanting to see what insights you gained about the relationship between Adams and Washington in the course of your research. And was there anything that surprised you about how either or both of them approached that relationship?
Yeah, you're right. It was a really complicated one. And I think one of the things that was so interesting was to see how complicated the vice presidency and the president were from the very beginning. That is certainly something we've seen in the 21st century, that there's sometimes this partnership and sometimes it's tense and there's some weirdness, but that was really true from the beginning. And their relationship had been kind of up and down from the start. They both met at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and Adams was actually instrumental in securing Washington's nomination as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But then they sort of started to have a little bit of rocky waters because Adams was a little bit critical of Washington's leadership at low points during the war, and that criticism got back to Washington. Washington wasn't really all that forgiving of those that criticized him. He had a fairly thin skin. But I think they absolutely had respect for one another. They had respect for their service, respect for their patriotism, respect for their commitment to the Republic. And so when Adams was elected as vice president, Washington did initially reach out to him to get his input on crafting the social precedents for the presidency, how he could entertain, how he should interact with citizens. Some of the things that I talked about in my first book, The Cabinet, that, he as first president had to come up with from scratch. And so Adams was, I think, an advisor early on. But then Washington began to lose faith in Adams' political judgment during what's called the title controversy, when Adams wanted a more ornate or elaborate title, and Washington preferred Mr. President, the simple one we have today. And from that point on, they saw each other all the time because John Adams attended all of the social events at the president's house. So they socialized probably several times per week on average, but they never talked. It was not, other than, the pleasantries that one exchanges sometimes at what we would think of as like political cocktail parties. And it wasn't until 1796, when Washington was contemplating retirement, that they actually had a serious conversation. And that did a couple of things. It meant that Adams didn't really know how Washington had managed the executive branch. It left him at a real deficit in terms of his knowledge about the internal workings of the presidency. And it also meant that when time came for the transition, they both didn't really seek each other out. And that was a little bit surprising to me, was how much Washington knew that he could have shared with John Adams that would have made his life a whole lot better. And he didn't. And I think it was a mistake in trying to cultivate this first transition, which Washington did so beautifully in some ways. But in others, I think he probably could have gone a little bit further.
Definitely. And that is something that is so surprising, and especially thinking in the modern context when we think of this handover of power that is so elaborate and involves so many people, and the fact that Washington, and granted, they didn't have any precedent at that point, but the fact that it was just, here you go, figure it out. It was just, it was surprising.
Yeah, it really was. And, not to get ahead of ourselves, but 4 years later, when Adams was in charge of the transition himself, he went about it in a very different way and ensured that there was more communication. I think because he had that sense of what it was like to come in dark.
Yeah. And speaking of his successor to the office, and we'll talk a bit more about, some of the ins and outs of the Adams presidency as we go along. But another person who Adams had a complicated relationship with during his presidency was, of course, his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. And despite the fact that the two would end up in opposition for most of Adams's 4-year term, with Jefferson really, he was really working at times to undermine the administration actively. You noted at the beginning of the presidency and towards the end of Adams's tenure, the two got together for private conversations and dinners, and it seemed like there was, at least at first, this attempt to try and forge a different relationship between the president and the vice president. And so I was wondering, in the course of your research, did you get the sense that there ever really was a true possibility that their relationship during this time period could have been at least collaborative or at the very least cordial if events had played out differently? And if so, how might that have impacted the history of the early republic?
It's such an interesting question. And I should say, just to put my own biases on the table, I tend to fault Jefferson here more than I fault Adams. So, include that in your minds when you hear what I have to say going forward. But I think Adams came into the presidency with a great deal of affection for Jefferson. He really genuinely thought that Jefferson was a good person, was a man of upstanding character. They disagreed on some things. He thought Jefferson was particularly naive about the French Revolution and the possibility of political violence. But he didn't hate him, and he didn't have that sort of partisan animosity. And to a certain extent, Jefferson felt the same way, but I think that he was much more distrusting of Adams. And so they, as you said, they initially had these conversations. They initially met before Adams's inauguration. They both made overtures to try and have a good relationship. But the moment things went in a way that Jefferson didn't 100% agree with, he basically turned on Adams and went straight into the arms of what is now called the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans. At the time, they called themselves Republicans. And so he immediately turned away from the administration that he was in and looked to support the political opponents of said administration. And I think that if he had been willing to give Adams the benefit of the doubt, just a smidge more, just a smidge, and willing to actually talk through some of those things, he would have realized how much more in agreement they were on a lot of subjects. Not always 100%, but enough overlap that they could have been productive working partners. How that would have played out is really interesting. I think that it probably would have at least somewhat prevented the split in the Federalist Party, or maybe not so much the split in the Federalist Party, but it would have allowed Adams to have another person to lean on other than what I call the Arch Federalists, which is the most radical wing of the Federalist Party in his cabinet. And it would have given him a lot more political options. Now, that's not to say that things would have completely unfolded differently, because I do think there were these two sort of wildly different visions of what the United States should be and who they should ally themselves with and things like that. But I think it would have made the development of the political parties and the intense partisan tensions a little bit less extreme.
Absolutely. And that partisanship, that's such a big component of the history of the Adams presidency. And, you've got the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans on one end, but at times Adams was having to fight even within his own party. And you mentioned the Arch Federalists. And one of those that I wanted to bring up is Theodore Sedgwick. He's one of those political leaders in the early republic who is often glossed over, but in your work, you mentioned at one point he served as Adams's closest confidant. And again, thinking of how that might have been different if Jefferson had been closer, but as it was, he did end up leaning on Sedgwick for a bit, but then they had this cooling of their professional relationship and ended up, had some really tense moments. And so I was wondering if you would mind sharing a bit more about Sedgwick and the role that he played in the narrative of the Adams presidency. And presidency's listeners know I always love finding obscure figures to talk about. So thank you so much for indulging me in exploring Sedgwick a little bit.
One of the things that I was so sad for Adams about was that most of the Arch Federalists that turned on him in his presidency for pursuing these moderate policies, for not wanting a super political army, for pursuing diplomacy, things that I think in retrospect we really applaud, was that so many of those people were his longtime friends from Massachusetts. They were his neighbors. There are people he had served with in the Continental Congress and in the Massachusetts State Convention to craft the Constitution. He had known a lot of them for decades. And so it was really quite personal. And this is actually one of the elements of the book that I'm most proud of, because Theodore Sedgwick is just not as well known, and his papers are not as well utilized because they're not digitized. And so they're in the Massachusetts Historical Society collections, and they're beautiful and they're incredible records. And he has great handwriting, which is always so nice to have that be a surprise when you're opening those boxes. But in those letters, especially in the beginning, he was in the Senate, and then later he was in the House of Representatives. And when he was in the Senate, he really was one of Adams' closest allies. And what's great about his letters is he describes, often to his friends back in Massachusetts, some of the shenanigans that are going on behind the scenes and some of Adams's political maneuvers. And that's so important because people really don't think that Adams is politically savvy. And these letters demonstrate that he really was. And so, they're very close, they're working very closely, and then they have this split. And it's really sad because he starts to describe Adams as this evil thing that they have to deal with, which frankly feels sometimes pretty familiar to our current moment when we're thinking about like intra-party turmoil and people turning on people within their own party. And to the way that that particular story ends, for them at least, is on Adams's ride home back to Quincy after he has lost re-election. Theodore Sedgwick is in the same public coach, which must have just been excruciating for both of them.
Yeah, I would not want to be on that coach with the two of them.
No, it would have been so awkward. And that is a long ride to go with someone you really don't want to spend time with.
Yeah, there is only so much talking about the weather that you can do on a long coach ride with somebody you really don't want to be there with.
100%.
Well, and I think that's an amazing thing. And one of the things that I love about your book is that you do highlight this political savvy that Adams has. And like you said, Lindsay, I don't think that he gets enough attention about that, especially as he goes along and you see him growing into the presidency. You see that really coming into play. But even in the early days, you start to see some of this. And in particular, he has a way of moving his agenda forward in spite of having all of these enemies surrounding him. And one of the things that he really pushed for was a strong Navy. And that was something like looking at his entire career, you see this issue come up time and again, and especially in his presidency, given all that was happening in terms of foreign affairs and foreign diplomacy. And so I was wanting to see, how do you see the Navy functioning during Adams's presidency as part of his approach to both domestic and foreign policy? Because it had a role to play in both of those.
It really did. The Navy was so essential, I think, to Adams's view of the world. And it makes sense. He came from New England, which was the heart of where most sailors came from. It was where most ships were built. It was where most timber was supplied. And so from the very beginning, he spent a lot of time in Boston, which was a bustling port. And so he just had a very good sense of the importance of the merchant marine, which were basically like the traders who were taking their ships across the ocean, the importance of trade to the future of the United States economy. And that was boosted by his time in Europe, in which he saw ways that the United States could engage in the world stage without necessarily having to participate in war. And that trade would be essential to the growth of the nation, to the survival of the nation, but was also something that the nation could offer in a way that few others could. And so from the very beginning, he had this keen sense of importance about how to cultivate and support trade. And in moments when war would happen, of course, those ships would be targeted, those ships would be at risk. And so from the very beginning, he understood that we have to protect our soldiers and our sailors. We have to ensure that they are not targeted, that they are not susceptible to this sort of attack. And we have to make sure that private citizens are not bearing the cost of protecting their ships and protecting American trade. So that is the domestic piece. And then that doesn't even take into account the foreign policy piece, which is that Adams understood that anytime you want to negotiate, negotiating from a position of strength is always a good idea. And, the U.S. had a tiny little baby army, but if they could have a navy, then that would make them stronger and able to withstand some of the provocations and be able to stand up against, frankly, some of the bullying that European nations were prone to from time to time. And so his entire view of the presidency was that the Navy was essential on all fronts long before you even got into a war. And then if you did get into a war, a Navy was really quite important.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, and one of the things that you do an excellent job in your book of highlighting is just how all this was wrapped up in the politics of the time, because you've got figures like Hamilton that are really pushing for the Army, and Adams is having to push back and say, no, we really need a Navy. The Army is fine. You're really not going to be able to do anything. And oh, by the way, I really don't want Hamilton in charge of the Army, but whatever, just go and do your thing. But we really need a Navy.
Yes, that's so right. And I think, it's hard for us sometimes today to think of a president as not supporting the Army. That feels very weird to us. But if we look at the context of the time, the Arch Federalists really wanted to use the Army for political reasons. They were using it as a spoils system to build the Federalist Party. They were talking about different ways they could use it to enforce domestic law. These were all things that we would be very uncomfortable with today. And as you said, Adams did not trust Hamilton as far as he could throw him. And he had been sort of forced by his cabinet and the other Arch Federalists and Washington into appointing Hamilton as number 2. So all of that combined with the fact that the Army was very expensive and Americans really hated taxes. They were very resistant to the taxes that were required to pay for the Army. He just felt like it was unpopular, it was dangerous, and it was personally challenging because he would have to work with people and be undermined by people he really didn't trust. So he had a lot of strong feelings against the Army. Some were personal, but some were very justified in the reality of the time.
Absolutely. And you can understand why he wouldn't necessarily want a trained military force right there who's being led by one of his political enemies, because another thing that you highlight in your work is that violence, or the threat of violence, was a presence in political life in late 18th century America. And you cite numerous instances, but one that particularly struck out to me was when there was a crowd marching towards the president's house in Philadelphia on May 9th, 1798, and Adams sent a servant to the War Department to get weapons. And you just really get a sense he seriously felt threatened, and enough we need to arm ourselves just in case. And so, Lindsay, I was wondering if you would mind sharing more about what you found in your research on the role that violence played in the political landscape of the time.
Well, Americans have always been, I think, a fairly violent people. If anyone has watched the John Adams miniseries, the depiction of the tarring and feathering is really quite accurate and quite scarring if you watch it. I haven't actually seen it in a very long time, and I still have very vivid mental pictures of what that was like. And so political life was really mixed with violence in a way that we would not find acceptable today. So, for example, it was not unusual for political newspaper editors to be beaten up, to be dragged into the streets, or, caned by their rivals. Of course, there were duels as part of a regular part of political life. There were threats of caning and brawls on the floors of Congress. So, that was something that Joanne Freeman has written about quite brilliantly up through the 1850s. But we generally expect our congressmen today to not come to, arms, but although that may not hold, but we'll see. Those are our expectations for the moment. And so if we combine that with, there was no Secret Service, there was no gate outside the president's house. Anyone could just walk up to the front door. A lot of men did have a rifle in their home. That's not the type of weaponry we have today, of course, but people were used to using arms. And so if we combine the lack of personal security with the very violent atmosphere, and then we add to that, there was no protection at the time against speech that could provoke violence. So today we have laws on the books that say, for example, you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. You are not protected. Speech that intentionally provokes violence is not protected. Those provisions were not on the books. And so newspaper editors and op-eds and different articles often called for violence. And so this was really a tinderbox. And you described that moment in May. It was the fast day that Adams had called for. And that event really blew my mind, because the worst was thwarted by the intervention of the Philadelphia cavalry, but it could have been horrific. And we don't really think about that type of violence being a regular part of political life in the 1790s, but that threat was always there.
Yeah. Yeah. We hope that our politicians are a bit more civilized nowadays. Not going to hold my breath, but we do at least hope that we can keep this streak running. But yeah, it is. And there's just so much about that time. And I know for me, that's one of the amazing things about studying these early presidencies. Even though there are things that we can relate to, there are things that, we can understand. There's so much about those particular times and instances and environments that are completely foreign to us that we wouldn't recognize nowadays.
Well, and I think that distinction that you drew is so important. One of the things that's really essential with studying history is being able to determine what is similar and what have we experienced before, but then also what is different. And that's quite useful because it helps us determine what lessons can we learn, what can we apply to today, but also what about our current moment is unprecedented. And, that's when people say, well, history repeats itself. No, it really doesn't. It rhymes. There are things that are similar. There are trends that reemerge, that return. There are characteristics that I think are common throughout multiple generations, but it's never exactly the same. And those distinctions are often as important as the similarities.
Absolutely. And, and you were talking earlier about how the president's house, there was no gate. Anybody could just walk up. And again, in our context, we couldn't imagine just walking up to the White House, but that was the instances of the time. And, there are a few instances in your work that really stand out as pointing out how different the presidency and the institution, the structure of it was so different. And one that really, and I've read it 2 or 3 times because I was like, wow, okay. You were talking at one point about the Adamses making their way back to Quincy in the summer of 1798, and all the beds at their usual stops were full. So they just had to lay a mattress on the floor. And we think of, in the 21st century, we couldn't imagine telling a president and first lady, hey, here's your mattress on the floor. Have fun. Here you go. So many people would be giving up their rooms or they'd kick somebody out. But it really points to this different conception of the presidency at the time. And I was wanting to see, how do you feel that the presidency was perceived in Adams's time? And was that perception based more on the office itself or on the individual holding it at any given time?
I love this question because there are so few things about life in the 18th century that feel more foreign to us than travel. Sometimes when I read their writings, I feel like I'm talking to someone I know, and it feels very relevant and so accessible to us. And then they describe their travel, and I feel bad about complaining about airplanes because I really should just shut my mouth. I have nothing to nothing to complain about in comparison. And it really did shape how politics worked. It shaped how the government worked. It shaped who was willing to be in office, the miserableness of travel and how long it took. So that's such an important point. And I'm so glad that you emphasized it. The presidency at the time was this very odd mix of, they both had incredible reverence for it and they really wanted to celebrate it and, appreciate it as though it was, not a king. They didn't want a king, but they wanted it to be this big thing that was celebrated and was respected. But they also, it was so new that there weren't centuries of tradition built up in terms of the prestige and the respect for the office. So I do think it really was initially Washington based. I mean, he instilled the office with so much respect and stature because of who he was. He was being called the father of the country before he even went into the presidency, which I think sometimes we forget. But then I think some of that does kind of linger onto Adams and lingers onto the office, but you can tell that they're almost trying to fake it until they make it, because they both have real respect for it and don't. And it's kind of an in-between. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about the Adams presidency is just how in between it was, that it didn't have the institutional power we give the office today in terms of the respect and the adherence to those norms and precedents. And yet there was still something there. It wasn't treated like any other governor or executive at the state level.
And I think, and this is something that I've considered, in studying Adams and studying Washington, and it almost seems like Adams was struggling with this idea that he wasn't getting the same level of respect as Washington. And, that was one of the things that really struck out to me about this point in this instance in your book, because I was like, I couldn't imagine folks telling George and Martha Washington, here's your mattress on the floor. With John and Abigail Adams, they were more than willing to, but with the Washingtons, they would have found a bed or given up a bed. And it really does speak to, and Adams knew that. Adams knew that he was treated differently, even though and I think to some extent, Washington wanted the office to be treated with respect, regardless to who was holding it at any given time. But it was still, like you said, Lindsay, that in-between period of trying to figure it all out.
100%. And one of the ways in which I think it drove Adams crazy that he was not held to the same stature is he had no problem with Washington's birthday being celebrated when he was in office. And to a certain extent, I don't think he had a problem with Washington's birthday being celebrated once he died. But there was this in-between period where Washington was not president and he was still alive and his birthday was being celebrated. And both John and Abigail pointed out that that's very kingly behavior. That's very monarchical. And Washington wasn't asking for it. It wasn't like he was, demanding these celebrations. But it felt weird to them that in a small R republic, we were celebrating one person as though they were a king. And yet the American people just couldn't quite let it go. They kind of had to continue these birthday celebrations.
And meanwhile, John Adams was getting attacked for supposedly being a monarchist. And it's like, but Washington's birthday, come on.
Yes. I think he, in some ways, sometimes he has comments that you can understand why people interpret them as monarchical, but then he also has these comments that are extraordinarily astute, both he and Abigail. And after Washington died, for example, and the, ceremonies to celebrate his life carried on for over a year, at one point they said, even kings don't have this.
Yeah.
Isn't that a little bit odd? And I think that ability to assess the world around them and to accurately reflect when things didn't quite feel small R Republican should be counted as part of his political legacy.
Yes. And it's just, there's so much about, and it's funny to think about that this is just 4 years of history, but there was so much in that time and so many interesting moments, and we could go on all day about it. But one thing that I did want to talk about, and that's a really pivotal part of Adams's legacy, is the peace commissions to France. He sent 2 peace commissions, and they really played an important role in the history of his administration. And indeed, in the ultimate success of the second commission was seen by Adams as his greatest achievement in his tenure as president. And so I was going to ask you about the different dynamics present in each of those 3-man commissions and how the rationale behind Adams's choice of commissioners for each impacted how the commissioners in turn related to one another during their service, as well as the different results achieved by the 2 diplomatic missions.
Well, I'm so glad that really came out as such an important contribution of his presidency, because I do think that as Americans, we don't always appreciate diplomacy. We don't vote for foreign policy today, and we don't necessarily appreciate it back then. But especially when the nation was new and, still coming together, and the emotional ties between the states were so fragile, I think that war could have been fatal. And even though France was distracted by other nations, it still was the most powerful army in the world. And you never know when you get into war what might happen. And so Adams, while his final wishes were not really respected for his tombstone in the way that Jefferson's were, and so, we always tell the story of what Jefferson wanted on his tombstone, Adams later said that he felt that his pursuit of peace was really the most important thing that he did in his career. And that's quite a statement, because he had an amazing career. So the two different peace commissions, the first one he sent shortly after coming into the presidency, it was a 3-person commission. It was John Marshall, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, not to be confused with all the other Pinckneys because they tend to share names, and Elbridge Gerry. And the selection of those 3 was quite intentional. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney had been sent to France by Washington, and then he had been rejected by the French. And so Adams insisted that he be included in that commission because France could not be permitted to dictate who the American minister was. John Marshall was a very reliable Federalist, but he was, more moderate, and he was from Virginia, so you started to have good geographic representation. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was from South Carolina. And then the third choice was Elbridge Gerry. And initially, the cabinet had really opposed that choice, and Adams had put forth other names. But when they turned down the position, he selected Gerry and sent the name to the Senate without really telling the cabinet. And the reason he did so was because he was very close friends with Gerry, and he trusted that Gerry would be loyal to him, if not, and remain a partisan. Gerry was not a particularly political figure, and that was important to Adams. It was perhaps not a great choice because Gerry was notorious for allowing small differences to blow up the big things. He was notorious for being very stubborn about small, insignificant details. And even though Adams stressed to him how essential it was that the commission remain united, Gerry allowed himself to be split apart from the other ministers. And this is what is known as the XYZ affair. When they arrived in France, the French government, represented by the foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, sent unofficial envoys to go meet with the Americans and demand bribes and loans and all sorts of other insulting terms to even begin negotiations. The Americans refused. They were eventually kicked out of the country. And when word of this treatment got back to the Americans, or got back to the United States, Americans more broadly were outraged at this insult to American sovereignty and honor. And that's what led to what is known as the Quasi-War, where France and the United States were sort of half at war, half not. A couple of years later, as this quasi-war had been raging and Congress had expanded the Army and created the Navy, Adams started to have second thoughts, both because of the distrust for the Army that we've discussed and the fracturing of the political system, but also he recognized that it didn't really make sense that France appeared to want war. They were already at war with Britain, and if they declared war on the United States and they were going to push the United States into the arms of their worst enemy, so that's not a great political choice. And they needed American trade, especially in the Caribbean, to feed their colonies. So it wasn't in their interest to be at war with the United States. And then Adams started to receive all of this intelligence behind the scenes from his incredible network, basically, of diplomats and spies, including his son, John Quincy Adams. And this network was revealing to him that France really had had a change of heart and wanted to pursue diplomacy, was quite serious about it. And what was so essential about that network is they sent things directly to Adams as opposed to through the Department of State, which was run by one of the biggest arch-federalists, Timothy Pickering. So in a surprise move, Adams nominated William Vance Murray, who was the minister at The Hague, to be a new special envoy. And the Federalists were really opposed to this mission. And so as a compromise, he appointed 2 more Federalists to make it safer for Federalist interests. And they departed in November of 1799, went to France. Circumstances in France were very different than they had been 2 years earlier. Napoleon was in charge. And they ultimately signed the Treaty of Mortefontaine in October of 1800, which established peace and is the longest lasting alliance in the world. We have not been at war with France since. So it really was an incredible triumph. It just didn't come back to the United States in time to affect the election in the fall.
And you just wonder if news had arrived sooner, how that might have been perceived, and to your point earlier, we don't necessarily vote for foreign policy nowadays as much, but this was one of the big divisions between the parties, and how might that have impacted and been at play if they had known peace was just around the corner. It's one of those big what if moments. Would Adams have gotten a second term?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think foreign policy was a much more present subject for voters at the time because the federal government had relatively few domestic responsibilities. So their job was basically to manage diplomacy and trade and that kind of thing. And so I do think it would have had a big impact. I don't know that it would have ultimately given Adams the victory, but it certainly would have justified his political judgment. And I think it would have undermined some of the criticism, especially that of Alexander Hamilton, that he was unfit to serve.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and these commissions and reading about both of them is just fascinating, as cohesive as the second commission is, reading about the first and all the back and forth and bickering and, Talleyrand trying to play Gary against the others. And like you said, Gary doesn't do himself any favors. And it's funny, we're actually working on recording the Elbridge Gary episode for the Vice Presidency special series we do. And Alex is already like, oh my gosh, this guy is a character. I was like, yeah, and just wait. We haven't even gotten to the commission yet.
He's such a... we've all met these people in our lives who they are just convinced that they are right, even when there's no evidence to back that up, that assertion. And so sometimes his correspondence with his wife, they've obviously been gone for a really long time. I just wanted to shake him because he can be so annoying. And you're just like, how are you this oblivious to what is happening around you? So yes, he is if readers take a small portion of that, of my frustration with his ridiculousness, then I will consider that a job well done.
I love it. Yeah. And for listeners, you'll get to learn more about Gary in the special episode, but there are just so many times it's like, really, you couldn't just let that go. Really? This was the big deal that really? Oh my gosh.
So true. So I'm really looking forward to listening to that episode. That will be great.
Absolutely. And to kind of bring it all together, because we've talked a bit about Adams's legacy, and I think that's one thing that's a key part of your book and how things come together, because you say at one point, quote, George Washington created the presidency, but John Adams defined it. And so as we wrapped up our conversation, I want to ask you, what would you say is Adams's greatest contribution to the office of the presidency? And how significant was it that, as you noted at the end, quote, Adams had ridden into the presidency in his private carriage, but would be leaving as an average citizen?
In one sentence, Adams' biggest contribution is that he made the institution of the presidency stronger than when he inherited it. And so he left the office in a more stable place for those that followed, whether that was crystallizing the right for presidents to remove secretaries from office if they were, disloyal or insubordinate, defending the presidency against the army machinations, defending the president's ability to craft foreign policy, but also really starting to shape the norms and customs that serve as scaffolding for our political institutions. So much of our political process, especially the peaceful transfer of power, is not written down. In the last, maybe decade and a half, Congress has started to pass some statutes to try and make these things a little bit more clear and a little bit more concrete, but that's very recent. And even then, there's still so much that depends on the goodwill and the good behavior of people that are participating. That was especially true when they hadn't done it before. And so Adams started the process of the peaceful transfer of power and then started to teach Americans how to cultivate that. And that doesn't maybe seem as remarkable to us today because we've, I think, taken a lot of these things for granted, but he lost an election and he went home, and he did a remarkable job in between of trying to ensure that the transition occurred in a way that would allow his successor to come into office on the best possible foot. And that is a remarkable thing in the age of Napoleon when, you don't lose an election and go home. And so that contribution is, I think, pretty extraordinary. And it's symbolized by his choice to take the public coach, because what he was demonstrating is that once you are no longer in office, you are an average citizen. And that is the point of a republic, that no one is above the law. Everyone is, in theory, on equal standing. And once you are no longer in office, you're just like everyone else. And so the symbolism of that choice is, I think, extraordinary.
and he somehow managed that coach ride without throwing Theodore Sedgwick from the carriage. So
Yes. I mean, it started at like 4:30 in the morning. So, he was a little sleep deprived. So we should really applaud that restraint on his part.
For all the folks who think that John Adams has an uncontrollable temper, I think that is evidence that he could control it when he needed to.
Yes, he could hold his tongue. It was sometimes hard, but he could do it.
Well, and for our listeners, we have covered so much in this brief conversation, but there is still so much more that is available. And so I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Nation. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do in history, in helping to share this history and to help folks to understand how it connects and what we can learn from it and take into the present day. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was so great to chat with you, and I really appreciate it. And I'm grateful to all of your listeners for their love of history.
And we hope that you will join us again sometime. This is your second appearance on Presidencies, and whatever your next project is, whether it's Jefferson or somebody else.
I have not yet decided what the next project is, but I can safely say it will not be Jefferson.
After having spent 2.5 years with him for his series on presidencies, I think that's a good choice. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much again. And thank you to our listeners. Like I said, pick up Lindsay's book. It is an amazing work, and I know that Presidency's listeners will love it just as much as I did. Thank you so much again to Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky for joining me for this episode and for the insight that she provided about John Adams and his presidency. The book is Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic, and it will be on the book stands on September 5th, 2024. If you're listening to this prior to the publication date, you can pre-order the book through Porchlight to get 30% off for a signed copy complete with an Adams-themed bookplate Lindsay designed herself. I'll have a link to the pre-order on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and I'll share information on my social media around the release of this episode. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. Or you can connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast, all one word. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.